there, people. I'm Graham Oakes. I'm an independent consultant, as Alec has said. And what I really do is I help people think about what their current situation is. I help them think about what they want to achieve, and I help them think about how they're going to achieve that. So that may result in setting up technical architectures, that may result in setting up product development processes, that may result in setting up projects and programs. But one of the things I'm increasingly seeing as we're doing this with a variety of organizations in the public sector, the private sector and the not-for-profit sector, that questions about governance keep recurring. Sometimes these are implicit questions. People are having...
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Webinar Made Easy.
Subset of the organization that you're working with. Sometimes there are explicit questions. People are saying, well, we've heard that we need to address governance, we need to do something about governance, but we're not quite sure what it is. So I thought in this webinar, I'm really going to go back to first principles and look at what is governance, what are the benefits of having good governance, what are the problems if you don't address governance, and just think a little bit about what this thing is called governance. Then in the process conference later in February, I'm going to drill a little bit further into some of the common patterns and anti-patterns in governance that I run across, and throw out some ideas about how we can improve governance. But today is really about this question of what is governance? Why should I care about it? And I want to start off with a scenario, and very topical right now. Imagine that you're working for an organization that's affected by the weather. So it could be the Environment Agency, it could be a local authority, it could be a transport body, the National Rail Network, or a bus company or something like that. But you're affected by the weather, and you're affected by bad weather. So you've got floods, cyclones, snowstorms, whatever it is. And in this crisis, think about what your day is going to be like. You're probably going to find that there are lots of questions being asked of you. You've got people working in field crews being asked, where should we focus our energy? What should we do next? You've got customers coming in through call centers or through Twitter feeds or through websites or whatever, asking what's the status of your services, asking am I going to get to my destination. You've got probably questions around how you reconfigure systems. You need to reconfigure websites to put the appropriate information out and to prioritize the appropriate resources and the appropriate systems for your customers. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of decisions that you need to make, and you need to make them very quickly. And I sort of want to ask the question, well, what's really going to help you most now? Is it strategy? Is it governance? Or is it project management? And sort of my take on this is that project management, a lot of the skills of project management will be very useful in this situation, but right now you're not in a place where you can set up a project. This isn't the situation where a lot of the project management body of knowledge, a lot of the project management processes are really going to help you. Likewise, it's too late for strategy. Strategy is hopefully giving you the tools and the resources that you need in order to deal with this situation, but there's no time right now. Sit down and think about strategy. And what you really need in this situation is governance, because governance is about setting clear bounds to authority, telling people what they can and can't do, what decisions they can make for themselves, or what decisions they need to come back to other stakeholders to make those decisions. So in your field crews, for example, they're out dealing with crises, dealing with very difficult situations, probably short-staffed because some of them people haven't been able to make it into work and things like that. They need to know what they can do on their own initiative when they need to refer back to the centre to get more information or to get guidance about what to do. So they need very clear boundaries around their lines of authority. Likewise, people running systems need clear lines around what changes they can make, what decisions they can make for themselves, what decisions they need to refer elsewhere. Similarly, people in the call center, what information to put out, and all those types of questions. So in this crisis situation, you're in a place where making decisions is fundamentally, you need to make a lot of decisions very quickly, and people need to know what their lines of authority are around those decisions. And this is a governance question. And obviously it's brought to a head very much in this crisis situation, but these same types of issues recur day in and day out in our projects, in our processes. And what you commonly see in these situations is people, because they've got fuzzy boundaries around what their authority is, what decision-making rights they've got, they start to go off and do their own thing. And of course this means that your resources get fragmented, different parts of the organization start to focus on different aspects of the service you're giving, and so you start to give different messages out to customers, you start to fragment your resources, you start to operate less effectively. And instantly, I see a lot of fighting going on, a lot of finger pointing, a lot of demarcation disputes, people arguing about whether they should have been involved in certain decisions, whether they can reverse certain decisions because they weren't involved, lots of boundary disputes between different departments, different teams, and things like that. And again, this fragments your resources, it drains attention away. All this time you're spending arguing about how you're going to make the decision is time that you can't be spending actually making the decision, gathering the information you need, engaging with stakeholders, making and then executing the decision. So this again diverts you from your core purpose into these arguments. And again, it's a governance problem. And so that sort of then brings me into the next wall of fuzz that comes around that, which is, what is this thing called governance? Where does governance fit into this? Because probably as I'm talking about governance, a lot of people are saying, that's not what governance is to me. Governance is rule books. It's about checking off checkboxes against ISO whatever, or against COBIT, or against whatever other governance framework and standard. It's about rules and regulations. How does this relate to decision making? And what's happened with governance over the last 10 years is that the vendors have come and muddied the situation. People have come and said, well, we can create, we see that there's a governance problem in organizations. We can create tools to address that. And the tools address the surface characteristics. They address the easy things, the checklists and the rules and the regulations, but they don't address this core problem, which is how do we set clear lines of authority around the decisions that people can make, and how do we enable people to make good decisions, which is, for me, the core of governance. And that's a difficult problem in its own right. People, particularly senior political players within organizations, often benefit from having fuzzy governance. If they can bend the rules a little bit, then they can escape blame. They can operate within their own limits to their own ends without having to be fully accountable for what they're doing. So there's often a desire amongst certain players in an organization to fuzzy the bounds of governance, and of course defining up front, thinking about what are the lines of authority, what are the sorts of situations that we're going to find ourselves within. That's hard work in its own right. There's a lot of hard bread and butter work involved with defining a governance framework, and a lot of organizations would like to avoid that work if they can. But my goal in this webinar is really to get us focused back on the core of governance, which is decision making. It's about setting out clear decision rights. And that sort of brings me back to definition of governance. And I take this definition from a Canadian body, the Institute on Governance, that works with particularly governance of First Nation communities and places like that in Canada. And they've defined governance as the process whereby societies or organizations make important decisions, determine whom they involve, and how they render accounts. And I like this decision because it's a very pragmatic decision. It highlights four key aspects of governance. And the first aspect is that decisions matter, because organizations make thousands of decisions every day. In our crisis situation, we're making thousands of decisions every day. In our day-to-day operations, we're always making lots of decisions, but only a small subset of those decisions really drive our organizational performance. They only really drive whether we achieve our objectives or not. And so we need to know which are those important decisions. We need to be able to recognize an important decision as it arises, so that we can focus our resources, focus our attention, focus our time on that important decision, and let some of the less important decisions go to the default option, or let people make those decisions in more fragmented ways, because they don't matter so much. It's these important decisions that we need to focus our resources on. The second aspect in this definition is the right people are involved in those decisions. Decision-making is, important decision-making particularly, is about people. Unimportant decisions, you can automate them fairly well, but the important decisions, ultimately it comes down to someone's judgment. People need data, and I'm very aware of what's going on in things like big data and the impact that can have on decision-making. But ultimately, it comes down to people exercising judgment, these important decisions. And we need to understand who those stakeholders are. We need to make sure we get the right people involved in decisions when we're making. That's an acceptable process, this concept of due process. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, having a well-defined process for decision-making means that we don't need to make it up as we go along. And I work a lot with organizations and things like procurements, and you find people making up their decision criteria, making up their decision process as they go along. And this drains a lot of resources from the actual decision-making. You're spending time arguing about the decision process rather than arguing about the pros and cons of the different options that they're deciding between. And so it diverts their attention from the really important stuff. The second reason that we want to have a well-defined process, we want to follow this well-defined process, is it gives legitimacy to the ultimate decision. If we've involved the right people, if we follow the process, then there's much less grounds for people to come along later and challenge that decision. That's very important, obviously, if you're working in a regulated environment. But even in non-regulated environments, you often find that people that weren't involved in the decision-making process will challenge the decision, won't buy into the decision, unless they can recognize that the right people have been involved and followed the right process. And then the next that this brings out of our governance is rendering accounts. And I'm very conscious that in many organizations, accountability has become synonymous with blame these days. But for me, accountability is a much bigger concept than blaming. It's very much around feedback. It's about how do we track the outcomes of our decisions? How do we take action to improve our decisions? Because we're not going to get it right every time. We're often making decisions in very fuzzy and uncertain situations. We get fresh information after we've made the decision, and we may need to change the decision in light of what we've learned. And this accountability is all about making sure that we're tracking those outcomes, constantly acting to improve things. And some of that may be blame. There may be times when people are consistently making bad decisions, and we need to think about how those people fit into the process, what we should be doing about those people. But that's only a very small set of it. There's a lot more that we can be doing around accountability, around building feedback mechanisms. And it's only when we start to think clearly about governance that we start to build those feedback mechanisms in effective ways. So I want to sort of quickly go through those a little bit detail. Why do we care about the right decision? Why do we care about understanding the important decisions? And this is, firstly, we can prioritize, focus on which decisions matter. And secondly, we understand the context of decisions. If we thought about what our objectives are, how different decisions tie into those objectives, what are the things that drive objectives, then when we actually get into the decision-making situation, we understand how our decisions are going to affect objectives. We know which are going to counter certain objectives, how they're going to make various trade-offs come to the fore, and things like that. So doing this thinking up front prepares us to make good decisions in the situation. And this aspect obviously brings governance very much in line with and overlapping with strategy. You can't divorce governance from strategy, because it's strategy that defines objectives and defines the means you're going to take to get to those objectives. But governance works with that around making sure that the right people are making the right decisions in order to further those objectives. The second aspect of governance is the people involved. All the people involved, partly because we need to bear on decisions. We need technical expertise, we may need legal and marketing and other types of expertise involved with our decisions. We need to make sure that those experts are brought into the decisions at the right time, that they're given the right context to contribute their expertise, and that we're listening to them. We need to understand other perspectives. We may have other stakeholders to engage with. One of the reasons I like working for not-for-profits is that they have very large, very diverse sets of stakeholders, the community, different aspects of the community. They have to deal with regulatory bodies, they have to deal with government, they have to deal with their private sector partners and things like that. They've got a lot of stakeholders to consider, and that is always makes things very interesting. But even in situations where you've got fewer stakeholders, it's important to make sure that you have considered those stakeholders, that they are involved in the decision-making process to the appropriate extent. People buy into the outcomes. If we engage with people at the right point in the decision-making process, people will buy into the outcomes, which means they're going to execute the decisions better. And again, making a good decision without setting yourself up so that people can execute it is a pointless exercise. Decisions all about something that people can then go and execute those decisions. You don't derail unexpected quarters when we involve the right people, when people are brought in. But fundamentally, you want the right people in the first time. We don't want to spend a lot of time during our decision-making process working out who to consult. We don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the contact numbers that I need to use to get in touch with people. Again, think back to the opening scenario when we're in a crisis. We need to know who the decision-makers are. We need to know what their contact details are, what their mobile phone numbers are, and things like that, so that we can contact them quickly to make decisions. We don't want to get caught up in boundary disputes. We don't want to get fights between people as to who's got the right to make which decisions and things like that. And we don't want to bring lots of people into our decisions that don't need to be involved. And the sort of flip side of a lot of decision making in many organizations is that they set up large committee groups of people that really aren't interested in the decision, because they haven't thought about who are the core of people that really need to be involved in making any given decision. And of course that wastes everybody's time. It wastes the time of people that have to set up meetings and engage all these people. It wastes the time of people that are coming to meetings that really have no interest in. The third is the process. Well, the right process, we know what to do. We don't have to make up a decision-making process as we're going along. And if we know what we're going to do, we know how we're going to do it. We can set up training for people so that they understand the decision-making process. If you look at emergency services, organizations that are frequently dealing with crises, you look at the military, which is set up to deal with crises in its core operations, then they spend a lot of time running simulations, running scenarios, running training exercises that put people into something that approximates the real situation, so that they have experienced the decision-making process, so they can practice the decision-making process, and so it becomes second nature, so that they can make decisions quickly and effectively when they get into the real-world situation. And in our day-to-day life, in our organizations, we may not be dealing with that sort of crisis, but we can still benefit a lot more than most of us do, by setting up training scenarios and helping people think through in advance how they're going to make decisions so that when they get into the thick of things, they make effective decisions. So this is time we don't waste time defining bespoke processes if we've already defined our processes up front. We don't panic in emergencies, and again, this is something that I spent 7 years working with the RAC, working a lot with breakdown operations, and you see a lot of time when people get into an emergency situation, they do the first thing that comes to mind. They know they've got to act quickly, so they just do the first thing that comes to mind because they're in a panic state, and that doesn't give you good decision making. You want to have a well-defined process. You want to know where you stand. You want to be well trained when you're in an emergency situation, because that gives you that extra few seconds to think things through and to make good decisions rather than to make panic decisions. And again, that feeds through into day-to-day operations. People, when they're under time pressure, when they're under pressure from customer demands and things like that, they still risk making panic type decisions because they don't give themselves that extra few seconds to think things through. If we train them appropriately, if we give them the right process to fall back on, then they have less need to fall into those panicked items. And again, the right process, as I've said, it helps people buy into the outcomes. It helps us avoid getting derailed down the line. One aspect of governance, of accountability, of building feedback loops. So a thought in advance, how are we going to track the outcomes of our decision-making process? How are we going to recognize whether we're on course or off course? Because often what happens, and again, see this in projects a lot, projects get off course gradually. Fred Brooks said, how does a project get to be a year late? One day at a time. And it's only recognized after months that you started to veer off course. But if you start to think, if you recognize earlier, if you recognize 1 or 2 days in that you're starting to veer off course, it's much easier to correct course. It's much easier to fix things. And so we want to be thinking about how are we going to recognize that we're on course or off course so we can make these, we can adjust our decisions, adjust our course as we need to along the way. And this is part of the feedback mechanisms that our governance should be thinking about how we're going to steer back on course. What are the actions that we have available to us? What resources can we use so that we know when we recognize we're off course, we're well prepared to think about what we're going to do. We think back about the decision-making process itself. We're not always going to make good decisions. Sometimes we set up overly elaborate governance structures, or we forget key people in our governance process. And so we want to be thinking constantly about how can we improve our governance mechanisms, how can we ensure that we have got the right people without bringing in people that don't need to be involved, how are we making effective decisions and things like that. So this feedback doesn't just happen at the individual decision level, it also needs to happen at the governance level. How can we improve our governance? How can we prevent ourselves from making the same mistakes over and over again? And the if governance is weak, if there's problems with governance in our organizations, we see 2 core problems. Firstly, we waste a lot of time, and secondly, we make a lot of bad decisions. We waste time because we put effort on important issues, we spend time because we define bespoke processes, we spend time with the wrong people, we get into lots of boundary disputes, a lot of time revisiting and rethinking about decisions when you don't really need to think about this. And this is all a sign that we haven't thought through our decision-making process and our decision rights appropriately. We set decisions because we haven't got the feedback. We're not steering ourselves back on course when we need to make decisions because we're panicking. We make bad decisions because we lack time. Often those things on the left, they're the things that rob us of time for decision making, the things that mean we're spending time thinking about the process rather than the decisions themselves, mean that when we actually get to make a decision, we've spent so much time defining our process, engaging with people, that we haven't got time to think about the options and to weigh off the pros and cons of the various options. So we end up making rushed decisions anyhow, and rushed decisions often tend to be bad decisions, because they overlook key information, because they neglect criteria that are important to certain stakeholders and things like that. With those perspectives. So the flip side that I see in many organizations, many projects, there's enormous amount of time wasted making bad decisions because they haven't spent a little bit of time up front thinking about what the decision-making process is going to be, who's going to be involved, what are the important decisions that they're going to focus on. So this one clear statement that well-defined governance helps you make better decisions. And certainly when I'm talking with senior managers, this is the aspect of governance that I like to focus on. A lot of people focus on the sort of risk aspect of governance. If you don't comply with this governance, with these standards, with these regulations, then you'll get fined, you'll go out of business, things like that. And managers listen to that. They know that they need to deal with governance in that perspective, but they don't really like it. They don't like the fact that they're sort of being blackmailed into dealing with governance. But if you can start to talk about governance as something that helps the organization make better decisions, that it's something that most executives can relate to. They know that they spend a lot of their time making decisions. They know that they spend a lot of time making decisions under time pressure, under pressure of lack of resources, with complex trade-offs and things like that. And anything that helps them make better decisions is going to go into better performance for the organization. And this also applies to people on the ground, people in project teams, in product teams, and things like that. If we can help them make better decisions, then that helps them do their job better. And everybody ultimately wants to do a good job. But if we take governance to them as the sort of governance police, as the checklists they need to fill in and the forms they need to sign off and things like that, then governance becomes bureaucracy, and it becomes something that they avoid, something that they at times will actively try and subvert. But if it's something they can see is helping them make better decisions, it's something that they'll start to buy into. An important thing there, I try not to talk about governance. So I'm increasingly trying to talk about well-defined governance, because as I see more different organizations and more different types of projects and more things going on, I find it harder and harder to define what is good governance, because it's very context dependent. Good governance for a police service or good governance for a ambulance service in a crisis situation is very different to good governance in a call center. It's very different again to good governance in somebody that's doing early stage research for product development. Is very different again to somebody that's providing building the actual product in a factory somewhere else. When people talk about good governance, often what they're talking about is, I've got my way for making decisions and I want to promulgate this as the ideal way for making decisions in every circumstance. And for me, that just doesn't work. You need to have different styles of governance, different ways of making decisions in these widely different contexts. But in every one of those contexts, you need to be thinking about how you're going to define governance in advance. Who are the people that are going to be involved? What are the decisions they're going to focus on? What sort of processes should they be thinking about to make their decisions? What sort of feedback mechanisms do we want to have in place? Because if we have those in place, then we've got the resources we need, we've got the thinking we need to make better decisions than most of us are generally able to make in our organizations. So if you don't think about governance up front, then you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about governance during the decision-making process. You're going to spend a lot of time coming back and revisiting, defining bespoke processes, spending a lot of time arguing about decision rights and revisiting decisions. So good governance is what lets you focus on the decisions rather than the process. Get the decision-making process defined up front, then you can focus on defining your options, defining your trade-offs, making decisions rather than on the decision-making process. If you do it up front, you're going to do it for every decision, almost guarantee it. I haven't spent a lot of time today talking about policies, standards, guidelines, all the things that for many people spring straight to mind when you talk about governance, because for me they're not the primary aspect of governance. There's certainly things that come out of thoughts about governance as you start to identify what are the important decisions, who's involved, what's the process. Then you'll start to identify commonality across decisions. You'll start to identify places where policies can be put in place to automate some of the decision making and things like that. And so these things become very important artifacts to support your decision making, but they're only supporting artifacts. The key thing is making it possible for people to execute judgment and to make those important decisions, because they're the ones that really matter for the performance of the organization. Another thing I'll talk about more in the conference in February, different forms of governance. What are some of the different styles that governance can take on? And the two that spring most to mind to me are bureaucracy and anarchy. Bureaucracy, where you have lots of rules and policies and everybody just is expected to follow the policies, and anarchy, where more or less everybody goes their own way. And all of these have a place. There's a place for anarchy when you're doing research in complex environments and you want to try a lot of different experiments. Then an anarchic governance style makes sense. There's times when bureaucracy makes sense, when it's very important to have consistent decisions across a widely spread organization, and speed of decision making maybe isn't so important. Then bureaucracy can be an appropriate form of governance to have in place. But generally we're not dealing with those situations. Generally we're dealing with fairly routine decisions. Generally we're dealing with decisions in project context and things like that, where we may want different forms of governance. If we don't think about what form of governance, if we don't actively address that governance, then it tends to decay into anarchy, it tends to decay into bureaucracy. And some organizations, I think, tend to go more one way or the other, but organizations seem to go one or other of these ways in their governance structures if they don't actively address it. And these structures, anarchy and bureaucracy, can be appropriate in some circumstances, but by and large they're not going to be appropriate for most of your decisions. So you need to be actively addressing governance, so you're setting up the appropriate governance structure. So that's all of today. Thinking about what is governance, why should I care about it? As I said, I'll spend more time in the end of February at the conference looking a little bit about different forms of governance, different patterns of governance, and some heuristics to think about when setting up governance. But today has laid the ground for that. There are my contact details on the screen. I'm very happy to answer questions now if the sound or the system is working, or to answer questions by email later. Very happy to talk face-to-face at the conference in February. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time today, and hopefully the technology is working now, so I can hear any questions or see any questions on the screen.
Thank you very much, Graham. This is Alex again. Apologies again, everybody, for the problem we had at the beginning. We're not quite sure what happened. We think it's possibly something with the webinar hosting platform that we're using. It seems to have resolved itself. And thank you, Graham, for an excellent webinar. There is time for questions, so if you've got any questions, please type them, and Graham will be able to answer them for you. Just one last thing to mention, I think as Graham mentioned earlier, if you'd like to meet Graham, he will actually be presenting at the Process Improvement Conference, which is on the 27th of February in London at Millennium Gloucester Hotel. If you go to unicom.co.uk, you'll be able to see it on there. And we will be making a recording of the webinar available afterwards. So I'll hand over for any questions. A few questions coming in. Hi Graham, we've got some questions that have come in. One of the questions is, are there any templates that you can share? Too often governance is measured by compliance. I think actually there's two questions there. I've started reading them together.
The first question I've got here, too often governance is measured by compliance. Yeah, but I agree completely that the compliance industry has taken over governance, and it's because vendors have got tools to sell, and it's compliance that you can build tools for. And compliance is important. We need to obviously comply with the law. We need to comply with regulations. There's a lot of reasons why we might choose standards to comply with and things like that. But fundamentally, it is about judgment and it's about decision making for me. And so we've sort of been steered by certain vested interests too far towards compliance. The next question, are there any other useful techniques to get executive buy-in to address governance apart from better decisions? I wish I had some. It's the thing that has worked for me is better decisions. It's often it helps, and again I'll talk a little bit in February about a workshop structure that I use where I work with teams of people to say who should be making certain decisions. We typically brainstorm 10 or a dozen decisions that apply across the organization that people are making in different places, and we look at the decision rights, who should be making these decisions, and it's often very interesting. Like I can think of one telco I worked with where all the project managers said, well, that's a program management decision, and all the program managers said, well, that's a project management decision, and everybody simultaneously said, and I don't know why we're all so slow at making decisions. And the fact was everybody was leaving decisions for other people in the organization, and it became very clear when you looked at this pattern of decision making that they just simply people weren't taking accountability for decisions. Nobody was making decisions, and that's why this organization was moving very slowly. If you can show patterns like that to senior managers, they start to see, yes, we need to do something about it. But it does come down to decisions. It does come down to understanding what are the important ones and what are the sort of dysfunctions that we've got right now in making those decisions. That's what's worked for me. The next question, reference materials relevant to the financial industry. I'm not a financial industry expert, so I know that there's obviously a lot of regulatory material, and there's a lot of organisations that are pulling together the relevant regulatory and standards material that applies in the finance industry, and I couldn't pretend to be able to help you navigate through that. But the finance industry beneath that has the same issues as everyone else. It needs to make good decisions. It needs often to coordinate quite dispersed workforces in order to give consistent guidance to its clients and things like that. And so it does come down to understanding what your decision-making structures are. And if you understand those decision-making structures, and if you clearly set out what the decision rights are, then my view is that that's going to make it a lot easier to comply with the regulations. So if you start out with decision rights and decision-making processes and clear lines of authority, then it becomes much easier to implement a lot of regulations and policies. Whereas if you start with the secondary artifacts, with the policies and the standards and the regulations, and you try and apply them almost ad hoc to your organisation, you suddenly start to end up with quite a tangled mess. The next question I've got here, auditing behaviours is therefore critical if we're to get this right and learn where risks exist. I've written a book obviously on project assurance, and so I've got a lot of, I believe in auditing in some ways. I mean, there's a question about exactly what you mean by auditing. but there certainly needs, again, as part of your feedback mechanisms, there needs to be a way of recognizing, are you following the appropriate decision-making processes? Are you involving the right people? Are you tracking the outcomes of your decisions? So those feedback mechanisms, they can be partly built into your day-to-day operations, they can be built into your review and your assurance processes, and they can also be built into your audit processes. And audits help keep us honest, and we all fudge things occasionally. We all do cut corners, either because we're under time pressure or because we've got so many other pressures on us, or because we don't quite understand the need for certain controls and certain mechanisms. And so there's always a role for auditing to come back and be part of this feedback mechanism. So certainly the feedback and the accountability, auditing plays an important part in that. So yes, we need, as part of our governance mechanisms, to be thinking about what our auditing mechanisms are going to be. And the next question I've got here, better decisions can only be made based on better understanding of the context of the decision system and process, and where in the past they have been either appropriate or not. It says behavioural audit. And yes, obviously, understanding is important to making decisions. We need to have some view of history. We need to have some clear view of what decisions worked in the past, what didn't work in the past, why they didn't work in the past. We need to understand how each decision fits into our broader strategic framework. And I sort of mentioned big data at one point in the webinar there. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on with big data, because it's giving us a way of doing some of that analysis, of tying things into the historical impact of decisions and things like that. It's giving us real data to work with. And so I believe that we need to go back to human judgment for our important decisions as the primary mechanism, but that doesn't in any way discount the value of having the appropriate data, having the appropriate tools to organize that data and to view that data, because that gives us an important feedback mechanism to help us improve our decision making. Likewise, having the right strategy in place, understanding what our objectives are, what are the mechanisms that we're going to use to achieve those objectives, what's the path that we plan to take in order to achieve our objectives. That all gives us context for our decision making. So governance can't be disentangled from analytics, and it can't be disentangled from strategy and things like that. And I'd like to sort of be able to present easy answers where everything wasn't tangled up with everything else, but these things are naturally tangled up. But if we spend some time thinking clearly about governance, then we start to think about what are the sorts of analysis we want to do, what's the sort of data we need to collect. We start to inform some of our strategic thinking. We understand who are the people, what are their competencies, who are the stakeholders, things like that, that inform some of our strategic thinking. So these things build from each other, and a clear view of governance certainly informs the others and is informed by the others. So those are my quick take on the decision, the questions we've got there. Are there any other questions?
No, I think that seems to be all the questions. So again, thank you very much, Graham, and thanks everybody for joining. And hopefully we'll see some of you on the 27th of February. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Alec.